Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. This is the first session of Revelations from the Whirlwind with Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky. I hope I got it right. um, this course will explore the revelations at Sinai, Yechezkel's Merkavah vision, Eliyahu's encounter with the still small voice, and Iyyov's confrontation with divine justice. Sinai represents a collective awe-inspiring experience of clarity and law-giving, while the later revelations highlight deeply personal encounters that grapple with divine majesty. Israeli here, subtlety and mystery. Students will examine the evolving dynamics of prophecy and the diverse ways these encounters shape the understanding of the divine. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky is the Director of Judaics at Mainline Classical Academy in suburban Philadelphia, Director of the LEM Legacy Project, an accomplished editor, author, and lecturer, and was a member of the inaugural class of Sachs Scholars. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Sinensky.
I see some new faces. I see familiar faces as well. So it's a pleasure to see all of you. And I particularly want to congratulate all of you for being timely. And so excited to reward you and jump right in. One of the topics that we think about regularly with the upcoming holiday of Shavuot is the theme, of course, of revelation. And what I wanted to do is to, as you can see from the title, to look at a specific set of revelations that I think stand out in particular. Of course, revelations from the whirlwind. Technically speaking, of course, the holiday of Shavuot, the events of Matan Torah, of the giving of the Torah at Sinai, do not specifically involve a whirlwind per se. We don't see the Hebrew word se'ara or sa'ar, literally, again, a tempest or a whirlwind utilized or invoked in reference to the giving of the Torah at Sinai, not in Parshat Yitzro, the first account of the revelation, not in the account of the Ten Commandments that appears later on in Parshat V'etchanan and Sefer Dvarim. We don't find it even in the descriptions of the revelation in Sinai, in Sefer Tehillim. We don't find that language, but certainly the notion of thunder, the notion of lightning, the notion of a miraculous sound and light show, and overwhelming experience of revelation, certainly we find present at the revelation at Sinai. But what I wanted to think about is not only the revelation of Sinai, but the revelation of Sinai and the notion of revelation as a whole in relation to subsequent stories in Tanakh, in which we find this theme of revelation from the Se'ara, from the Sa'ar. And we're going to look today at the stories of Eliyahu, next week at those of Yechezkel, specifically the Maaseh Merkavah, the ascent to heaven in the fiery chariots, and then finally the story of Iyyov, or God himself at the end or toward the very end of the book, after all of the dialogue, after all of the discourse, the friends, Job, Iyyov himself, all the back and forth, the suffering, the struggles, the tremendous angst and anxiety that Iyyov experiences in his search for consolation. With all of that, at the very end, God appears once again to Iyyov himself with some sort of explanation, some sort of either account for his suffering or lack thereof, but in a way that brings a sense of comfort, a sense of either an answer or at least a presence for Iyyov to latch onto, and somehow helps to resolve all the difficulties. Thank you, Evie, for linking the source sheet down at the bottom. Much appreciated. I'm not going to be sharing my screen because I do enjoy connecting directly with the participants in any way possible. But you can certainly bring it up on your computer. You can print it out if you haven't yet and access the share in that way. What I'd like to do is to jump in with regard to not yet the story of Eliyahu. We'll come to that in a moment, but let's first define terms. And every time we talk about the notion of what right, so revelation from a whirlwind, from a se'ara, it's worth first defining, well, what is se'ara? It's a biblical term. It appears some 100 times, but what exactly is it? Generally translated as a whirlwind, but I think sometimes it means something a little bit more specific. First meaning, and you can see this on the sheet, is a tempest, if you will, in Shakespearean terminology. Right? So a tempest, not just a wind, not just a ferocious a ferocious whirlwind, but a whirlwind in context of a set of precipitation, an event, specifically when it comes to rain. We see this with regards to the word sa'ar, the masculine form of the feminine se'ara, but one that I believe in the end, while we can try to negotiate or to refine slight nuances and see the exact difference between the two, let's say for our purposes that they're one and the same. It's quite difficult rather to discern any difference between them. So therefore, let's assume that the two are the same. This first usage of sa'ar or se'ara as a tempest appears right here at the beginning of Sefer Yonah. So God sees that Yonah tries to run away on the ship. Hashem hitil ruach gedola al hayam, the first source on the sheet. Vayhi sa'ar gadol bayam ve'oniyach cheshiva lishaver, the Lord cast a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest indeed upon the sea, and the ship was likely to break apart. So Yonah seeks to run away. Famously, we have this tempest, this sa'ar, that seeks to cause Yonah to capsize. The entire ship is threatened with being capsized, and so God has thereby brought this tempest upon Yonah. One instance among, again, dozens upon dozens that appears over the course of Tanakh, but this is one classic meaning, a rendering of the word se'ara, namely a strong, powerful wind that is accompanied by rain, or that accompanies rainfall, a storm in particular. We do, however, find a second related meaning, probably a derivative meaning. We have this all the time in many languages, but in particular with regard to biblical Hebrew, which has a relatively narrow vocabulary. Just ask modern Israelis. Evie, you can probably tell us all about this, that there are countless words that we encounter that are English or borrowed from other languages, just simply because historically biblical Hebrew does not does not incorporate too many words. Hebrew is not a living language in the same way, at least outside of scholarly circles. And so comes Eliezer ben Yehuda and others early on during the period of the Zionist movement, and we return to Israel, and so we have to invent words like, I don't know, glida. It's, even if it doesn't seem, it's not directly from English, but it's borrowed from Hebrew. Geled is something that's smooth. It's not really a relevant word, but okay, ice cream is smooth. We would use it that way, perhaps in more ways than one. It's kind of like a slang term as well. And so you have all these words, but because biblical Hebrew has a relatively small amount of roots, we find in many, many, many cases that you find borrowed terms that are used in various ways. This particular borrowed term, of course, is not too distant from this perhaps original meaning, and we find the theme of a whirlwind that is dissociated from rainfall or precipitation in a number of cases. I brought the second example, or the second source in the source sheet, as a particularly good example, in as much as it's actually used here in the opposite context of that of rain. It's actually used in reference to something that's dry. So this appears in context of the Nuvot Nechama, the consolations of Yeshayahu Hanavi, toward the very beginning of Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. It's in the same chapter as that section. God is coming to Israel and saying that with all of the 39 first chapters of the book of Isaiah, describing destruction, punishment, and so on, there will come a time of comfort once again. However, that comfort sometimes comes in context of the contrast between the Jews and enemies who seek to destroy them and will in turn be destroyed themselves, versus the Nechama that Yeshayahu Hanavi bestows upon the Jewish people. And so Isaiah declares, Af bal nitalu, af bal zora'u, af bal shorish ba'aretz, giz'am v'gam nashaf lahem vayivashu, u'se'ara kakash tisaed. So what do we find? Scarcely are they planted, scarcely are they sown, scarcely is their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them and they wither, and the storm carries them off like stubble. So what's happening over here is that the enemies of the Jewish people are being carried away by some sort of storm that's carrying them away by like stubble. It does not sound like this is they're withering here. It doesn't sound like this is a some sort of liquid. This sounds like they are just simply in a dry wind being carried away. And indeed, you find this in a number of biblical dictionaries, these two meanings related but slightly different of a se'ara. So we have the whirlwind that appears in context of the tempest. We have the whirlwind that appears in context of just a dry wind. And so we have these revelations that come to us from this sa'ara, from this type of, again, tempest or some sort of dry wind. Now, with those definitions of the word sa'ar, se'ara, operative, we look at Tanakh, of course, as I say, we see many, many, many instances of some sort of wind that's very powerful. In some of those cases, it accompanies some sort of revelatory experience, but not necessarily the revelation of God's presence itself. Yonah is a good example of this. If you think about the story of Yonah, Yonah doesn't have God reveal himself in a prophetic mode, in the classic prophetic mode, certainly. And to the extent that the experience of a storm is a revelation, it's not really so much a revelation proper or a direct revelation. It's more a warning sign, right? You're trying to run away from God. That's not going to work. I'm going to force you and the boat to go back in the other direction. God doesn't actually come out of the Sa'ar, out of the Se'ara, emerge in order to tell Yonah. It seems, in fact, if anything, that Yonah is the one who's not receiving any revelation that might be present. Recall that it's the other boatsmen who are on top of the ship, and Yonah, of course, is right underneath at the bottom of the ship, and he is Vayiradam, he's sleeping, he's seeking to flee. So clearly, with regard to Yonah, and I think arguably or likely in my view, regard to the sailors as well, it seems that God does not really reveal himself in this se'ara. However, when it comes to the story of Eliyahu, I think that it does. I think it is a form of revelation. And as we'll see, it's a very particular form of revelation. Now, I am going to pause. I will, once in a while, just ask a very quick question just to see what anyone thinks. You don't have to answer. I'm happy to answer if anyone doesn't have any suggestions. But if I were to ask you, what's the symbolism of a se'ara? Why would God sometimes reveal himself in this se'ara? Any thoughts? See a couple of, and feel free to just mute yourself. Evie, does that work? Can people mute themselves if they want? Just it's just us. Go ahead, Beth, please.
It strikes me that in the second example, the Sarah is sweeping something away,
Mm-hmm.
and it's as if God is removing superfluous chaff.
Hmm.
And in order for us to have a revelation of God, we have to kind of part the junk out of our
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm.
All the things that normally occupy our minds and our emotions and kind of
Mm-hmm.
cloud our vision.
Sure.
So it's as if God is
Mm.
moving that to
It's
sort
kind
of
of a moment
cover
of
our eyes.
it's a moment of clarity. That's
Hmm.
very interesting. Beth, that's an interesting insight, especially in context of Yeshayahu, because if you take a look at those psukim in that chapter and as well as elsewhere, what we see in those verses is the theme of flattening very often, right? God rides in and he flattens the mountain, he raises the valleys so that everything is yashar, everything is straight, everything is passable. All that was difficult to navigate until this point, all this difficult terrain is now accessible to all humanity. So I think that's actually that very well matches your suggestion that it has to do with this kind of a form of clarity. But I think even that form of clarity, I think it may affect clarity, but I would say what affects that clarity, I would say, even according to your explanation as well, is really, I think, God's strength, his power, right? The se'ara does not suggest some sort of kind of gentle, tender wind. This is not the sort of rain and wind that we are praying for when we recite Mashiv Haruach Morida Geshem or V'tein Talu Antar Lebracha, when we speak to God about bringing beneficial rainfalls upon us and our land. This is something terrifying. This is something that is scary. right, then this is or terrifying in the sense that it, of course, accompanies, in our cases, the themes of Revelation. So yes, there might be a certain clarity, but I think that clarity perhaps emerges from God's powerful, overwhelming presence can help to then clear the way, as you say, or to clear physical spaces, or to effect other kinds of communications or symbolisms through God's overwhelming force. And I think when we use the word tempest, I think that's presumably what we mean as well. I think what's interesting, though, is to think about in each of the stories we will examine, beginning with that of Eliyahu today, what exactly is the particular, unique symbolism that is associated with the meaning of Revelation through the Se'ara in this particular story. And so with that, let's take a step back and just recall the story of Eliyahu. The story of Eliyahu appears in context of the latter section of Melachim Aleph, of the first book of Kings. If you recall, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, doesn't begin as a messianic figure. He doesn't begin by showing up at traditional Brit Milah, circumcision. He doesn't even come to us in the original telling on the Seder night. Of course, he comes to us in the story of the zealous prophet who appears to us in the book of Kings. And one of the things that we see is Eliyahu, who's from the northern kingdom. You recall that 5 chapters earlier, in the 12th chapter, we're now jumping in our summary with chapter 17 of Melachim Aleph of the first book of Kings. We recall that 5 chapters earlier, the kingdoms had split. We had David HaMelech, King David. We had his son Solomon, his son Rechavam HaMelech. Rechavam gets into a whole tussle with the people. The people revolt. They don't want to pay even more taxes. Ultimately, Yeravam, the son of Nevat, founds the northern kingdom. It becomes idolatrous in nature. And ultimately, Yeravam is deposed. Other kings arise, all of them idolatrous, all of them wicked to one degree or another. And then perhaps the most wicked king and queen, in this case to date, arise to power in the northern kingdom, that of the kingdom, monarchy of Achav and Izebel. Achav is wicked, but he's a very interesting wicked personality in as much as he's committed to the God of his wife. In fact, he's very much committed to following whatever essentially his wife tells him. Izebel is not from a Jewish background. She's from a Phoenician background. She empowers the prophets of Baal, the non-Jewish idolatrous prophets who worship Baal, which among other things is the god of the Canaanites, precisely the primary nation, arguably, in the land of Canaan. The Jewish people are meant to not only physically depose, but also spiritually depose by ridding themselves of those idols, as Moshe Rabbeinu instructs the people in the book of Sefer, in Sefer Devarim. And Eliyahu was frustrated. He's fuming. He's really, really frustrated with this whole situation. God is angry as well. The fury overtakes Eliyahu. He challenges the prophets of Baal in a moment of religious zeal to the famous contest at Mount Carmel, Har HaKarmel. You will recall that in chapter 18 of Melachim Aleph, he has all of them gathered together. He performs miracle after miracle. They are disproven. He kills, slaughters these idolatrous priests, all of them overturning the attempts of Izebel to kill the authentic priests of God, the authentic prophets of God in particular. Eliyahu not only survives the attempts of Izebel, not only manages to avoid all the search parties of the emissaries of Achav that he sends out in order to kill Eliyahu, but Achav overcomes him. And the people see, and the famous words that we recite in the Ashkenazic tradition at the end of Yom Kippur, the people bowed and they recited twice, Hashem hu ha'elokim, Hashem hu ha'elokim. God is the true Lord, God is the true Lord. Eliyahu overawed, he's so proud of all of his accomplishments. The next, he kills the Nevi'im of Baal. The next day, of course, the people wake up and they are worshiping Baal, just like the day before. Eliyahu was thrown into a tizzy, a se'ara of his own, if you will. He's frustrated. He's infuriated. What are these people? Why can't they do that which is right? Why can't they worship the Almighty God properly? Don't they learn anything? Can't they see the miracles that are taking place? The fury of God what is happening here? And he becomes incredibly frustrated. He flees to the desert. He has essentially what seems like a suicidal death wish. He throws himself starving. God sends an angel, gives him food, sends him, not coincidentally, 40 days and 40 nights, just like Moshe Rabbeinu sends him 40 days, 40 nights in the desert to none other than Horev, to Sinai itself, to that desert, perhaps even to that mountain, to receive yet again a revelation. God comes to him not yet with a se'ara, but at this point, God comes to him, passes by. If you take a look at the third source, V'hine Hashem over. Behold, God, this is toward the beginning of Perek Yud Tet of Melachim Aleph, God is passing by. Beruach gedola v'chazak mifarei karim, u'meshaber silaim lifnei Hashem. Lo v'ruach Hashem, v'yachar haruach ra'ash, lo v'ra'ash Hashem. V'yachar hara'ash ish, lo v'oish Hashem. V'yachar ha'ish, kol demama. Behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains. It broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. Revelation, overwhelming. A quasi-tempest, but without the rain, of course, if you will. But the Lord was not in the wind after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake after the earthquake, fire. But the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire, a still small voice, almost a little bit like Chad Gadya. But I think really what essentially God seems to be telling Eliyahu is that you think you're going to come to the Jewish people with overwhelming force. You're going to bring the sound and light shows. You're going to overwhelm them with miracles. You're going to take your flashes of anger on behalf of the Lord, and you are going to fight his battles. That's not necessarily the proper way in this generation and this time to connect with the people and to convey the word of God. Instead, what we want to do, what we need to do, is to utilize a gentler form of revelation, a kol demama daka. So God conveys this message, and yet it doesn't seem to work out. God ultimately replaces Eliyahu. He will send a new emissary instead. The very next instruction that he conveys to Eliyahu Hanavi, to Eliyahu the prophet, is go. You're going to appoint, as we'll see in a few moments, appoint a series of kings, anoint them, and among other people, anoint your successor. Right? So Eliyahu thinks he's being righteous, and he is being righteous. He's being overly righteous, if you will, overly zealous. He cannot settle down. He cannot calm down. He cannot engage with the people in a successful fashion. And perhaps just like his predecessor, Moses himself, Moshe Rabbeinu, who ultimately was the most pious, the most righteous person at that time, certainly the greatest scholar, the closest to God, nonetheless was no longer able to connect with that generation in the desert, became too frustrated. Why are you burdening me, God? I can't do this anymore. And God ultimately says, you're right, Moshe. This is not the right fit. I'm not necessarily punishing you, perhaps we can understand, as many have suggested, but instead I'm going to appoint Yehoshua in your stead. Similarly, God says, look, your approach is no longer going to work. Instead, I'm going to have you appoint your disciple Elisha, who will take things from here and perform miracles and perhaps encourage the people to connect with the divine in a little bit of a different way. Now, all that having been said, with this story behind us, there are a couple of other chapters that need not detain us right now. And very shortly after that, if you just jump for a moment a little bit further, if you go to the beginning, to the bottom of page 2, the beginning of chapter 2 in Malachim Bet, so a few chapters later, finally God makes true on his promise after, again, more Achav and Yezebel, tales of Achav and Yezebel, and various other stories. Vayhi be'alot Hashem et Eliyahu ba'se'ara hashamayim. And it came to pass when the Lord would take up Elijah by a whirlwind into heavens. And here we have explicitly the first revelation from the whirlwind, even though God had originally said that my presence is not in these overwhelming forms of revelation. Nonetheless, when God comes to take Eliyahu up to the heavens, and Elisha, as we will see, is there overlooking, he's there observing these events, God takes him up. Ba'se'ara hashamayim. So God is going to take him up. And the question I want to ask before we actually read the chapter is why? Why is it that this is the appropriate mode of ending the life of Eliyahu, of bringing him up to heaven? Eliyahu apparently does not die a typical death, does not seem to die a physical death in the classical sense of the term. Why is it that when God chooses to take him up to heaven, what is the symbolism? What is the significance of this miraculous ascent, of this miraculous revelation, if you will, from the whirlwind? Okay, so that's going to be the question that we're going to address. Anyone want to make a suggestion before I continue? Any ideas? I see Adina and Beth most clearly. Is it either you don't need to, but if anyone want to jump in, why not? All right. All right, so I'll make some suggestions and feel free to consider as we go along.
Can I make a
So
suggestion?
Reba, hi, how are you? Nice to see you.
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Please, yeah, jump
So,
right in, God.
thank you. I jumped. So I'm just thinking of other biblical deaths that are atypical. For example, Miriam's death, I think, was atypical. And if I'm recalling, and this one I'm a little fuzzy on that, Aharon's was as well.
Sure. Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
just want to posit that perhaps the mode of these atypical deaths is somehow reflective of their character. So, so Miriam was much beloved, as I recall, among the people, and they waited for her when she was ill, and so on and so forth. And Moshe, for other reasons, his manner and place of death were not revealed for a whole bunch of other reasons I don't think are particularly relevant. But I think a lot, Eliyahu, perhaps because he died the way he lived, very tempestuous and very out there and very full. So it seemed fitting that he would die that way as well. So
Yeah.
the way he dies and the way they lived. I just
Yeah.
wanted to throw that out.
No, I think that's an excellent suggestion. And just to actually buttress your idea, so with regard to some of the examples that you mentioned as well, I think it does fit. So Aaron, I assume you were alluding to this, but I don't know if you said it out explicitly, but Aaron dies al pina shika. So you certainly
Right.
have that, right? You have that motif there. He's Ohev Shalom, V'Odev Shalom, that he was a peace, he sought peace, etc. And with regard to Moshe, I think you're right as well, that no one's V'lo yada ish et kavurato ad hayom hazed, that no one knew his burial place until this day. So I think also Moshe dies in isolation from the people. So this idea of Moshe as the one who's the anti-Aaron, Aaron who's the anti-Moshe. They're complementary forms of leadership and therefore complementary forms of death as well. So I think you were right. And we're going to come to this with regard to Eliyahu. What I want to add, though, is not just the way that he dies, but also the way that his legacy is continued, or as I want to suggest, in a way, discontinued. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Beth, please.
One thing that has always puzzled me about being swept up to heaven in the whirlwind, if we think of it concretely in terms of earthly terms, if a person gets sucked up by a tornado or any kind of whirlwind at sea or anything like that, it's horrible. You know, they're being swept out to who knows where, and there's something tragic about it. And yet, it's almost like in this case, this being taken from the earth by whirlwind is somehow valorized. At least I get the sense that we think that this is some special privilege that is being enjoyed here. And so it's always, maybe I'm just too literal minded about it, but it's always just puzzled me why this is a special or unique occurrence. And I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point as well. And it actually touches, I'll do this in a little bit of different order precisely because you guys are making such great insights here. It doesn't really matter. So I really appreciate both comments. But what I would suggest here is really two things in response. Number one, it is possible, just as Reba said as well, that it's just that what would have been a very difficult and painful experience, not in a completely literal sense, but the notion of living this tempestuous life would have been insufferable for so many people, but that was exactly how Eliyahu lived. So I'm not suggesting he would have enjoyed, jumping in whirlwinds or tornadoes or the like just for the fun of it. Far from it. We don't need to read the book of Yonah or Yeshayahu or any of them, as you say correctly, to appreciate that. But I think that there's a way in which it is fitting. The second thing is I do think it's important to note that while traditionally most commentators, especially the Midrashim, earlier and later, mystical commentaries that talk about this as kind of like some sort of transition to this other world experience, that he doesn't die, etc. While most see it as a reward or as a positive experience, it's not explicit in the text. And while I haven't seen any commentators who specifically suggest that it's something negative, and we'll see in the Radak in a moment, he explicitly says that it's something positive, I do think that it's a plausible read of the story, either negative or just as something that it's not kind of not commenting on it one way or the other. But I think it is possible to even read it as a sort of a quasi punishment. You're going to live in this way. I'm going to take you from the world in this way. And if God is saying that his mode was ineffective and ultimately he was overly zealous, then maybe his death is overly fiery, if you will. So I think that that really is a possibility, and I think it's a very smart suggestion. So I don't know if we're meant to actually think that he had this little experience of physical suffering in that way, and I don't know that, Beth, that's what you're suggesting either. But I do think that there's a way in which there might be more ambivalence, let's just say, at the very least, to this experience than we might otherwise be led to believe. 100%. Okay, so what exactly is the significance of this event? We've already heard a number of excellent suggestions. I do want to say that one possibility, though, to be fair, is that this is some sort of reward, some sort of revelation, some sort of otherworldly experience, that God's power is associated with divine mystery as well, and some sort of perhaps even mystical either vision or experience and the like. Radak doesn't say explicitly, Rabbi David Kimchi, one of the classical Provençal Southern French medieval commentators, doesn't say explicitly that this was why it was that Eliyahu was brought up to the heavens, but he does come close to it. So if you take a look at the fourth source in total on the sheets, toward the end of page 1, so that which is, we'll see in a few moments, that they were going beyond the Jordan River. Must have been because it was told to Eliyahu through prophecy that he would be taken from beyond the Jordan. In other words, this was previously conveyed to Eliyahu. Otherwise, how does he know to walk there, as we'll see in just a moment? Maybe this was even, it's on the other side of the Jordan River, it's in the Transjordan. Perhaps he goes to the other side, just as Moshe wasn't able to enter the land of Israel, and therefore, by definition, was buried at Har Nebo on the other side of the Jordan River, just overlooking the land of Israel. So too, perhaps that was exactly the place where Eliyahu went as well. His level, his stature, as it says in English, for stature is close to that of Moses, our teacher. And recall that during his lifetime, as we noted previously, he goes to Har Choref, he has a revelation there, does Eliyahu, just like Moshe, and he even journeys for 40 days and 40 nights. We need not be overly creative or imaginative to conclude that the psukim, that the verses are explicitly, or at least very clearly, drawing a connection, drawing a correlation between the revelation there to Eliyahu and that of Moshe as occurred previously. And indeed, he says, V'tzam arba'im yom ve'arbaim laila k'Moshe tzam Moshe Rabbeinu. He notes that Eliyahu had nothing to eat. In fact, Eliyahu, when he went to die in the desert, God had to give him, through the angel, food to eat, but he has nothing to eat on the way to experience this revelation. So it's not just that he goes for 40 days, 40 nights in isolation from humanity, from the people, with some sort of mystical, otherworldly experience. Part of that's very specifically that he does not eat as well. So it is possible that this was some sort of reward. But again, I don't think that that's necessarily the most persuasive explanation for the ascent in a whirlwind, in part because, again, it's not entirely clear that Eliyahu's actions were entirely positive. Otherwise, Why does he then go and give up on himself and the people? Why does God come to him and say, look, I'm going to bring you to Har Chorev, that's true, but I'm going to tell you, God is not where you think he is. And why else does God immediately thereafter instruct Eliyahu to anoint his successor? So I think that that's quite difficult to suggest. Another possibility is, as we say, it's otherworldly. And just as we know that according to tradition, Eliyahu is associated with the coming of Messiah, so too, therefore, he cannot die. This is some sort of either reward or just the end of his life. He is not going to have a traditional death. He's going to ascend on high. He's going to go on to live some sort of otherworldly existence and descend to earth, whether at the Seder, whether for circumcision, and above all, to be the herald of the coming of Mashiach, of the Messiah. And indeed, this notion is not only rabbinic, the notion that he is associated with the coming of Mashiach is biblical as well. The classic pasuk, which we read on Shabbat Hagadol, the Shabbat preceding the holiday of Pesach, from Sefer Malachi, the next source, Hinei Anochi Sholech Lachem et Eliyahu Hanavi Lifnei Bo Yom Hashem Hagadol V'Hanora, and so on and so forth. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He's explicitly associated with Revelation. Interestingly enough, here it's with a terrible day, with a day of punishment, again, not against us, but against our enemies, that is very much associated with the character of an Eliyahu Hanavi, this fiery zealotry on behalf of the Lord, and he's going to come and reveal the Messiah. Perhaps that's why he goes up in heaven in this way. But the truth is that that too is difficult as a reading of the book of Malachim, because while this theme does appear in the work of Malachi, a much later prophet, perhaps the very latest prophet, in fact, almost certainly the very latest prophet in all of Tanakh, the book of Malachim, which takes place hundreds of years earlier, expresses nothing about this messianic theme. So to say that all of this story and this entire narrative can only be understood against the backdrop of a prophecy that is not to be delivered for hundreds of years, while plausible, does not seem to be the face reading or represent the simple understanding of the story of Eliyahu. So if it's not as a necessarily, at least, as a reward for his zealotry on behalf of God, if it's not as a precursor to his messianic heraldry, then what exactly is going on? What is the symbolism of not only this fiery or this tempestuous, as we said, revelation, but the rest of the story as well? And what I want to suggest is that if you take a look at the stories, you will see that I think it's more than just a revelation. It's that the form of revelation of Eliyahu, yes, is consistent with his life, but more than that, that it's meant to set up a sharp contrast to the transition of power to his disciple Elisha was a very different way of leading. We obviously don't have time to go through all the stories of Eliyahu and Elisha, even in summary form, never mind in any level of depth, but suffice it to say that there is a host of striking parallels between the two. Not only are the two similar, but in fact, Elisha himself fulfills the prophecies of his predecessor and steps in for him. So God in psukim that we won't read right now, but the psukim immediately on the source sheet, immediately following those of Malachi, where it describes a little bit earlier that God says to him, to Eliyahu, well, go and you're going to anoint all these others as the kings. It's very interesting. Eliyahu himself does not anoint all of them king. Who does so? It's actually Elisha, as if to say that Eliyahu's shoes are being filled by Elisha. It's not just that there is another prophet who's waiting in the wings. It's almost as if Eliyahu has not fully completed his mission. He's not realized his aspirations. His role as a Navi, and he requires his disciple to enter in his stead and to anoint kings and to perform many of the same miracles in the same way as his master, but with a different kind of character and to effect a different, perhaps more friendly, warm, inviting type of result. In fact, we see this even in the names themselves. Someone once pointed out to me, I'd never heard this until quite recently. It's very interesting. You know, Eliyahu is the one, as we said, is the zealot for God. And Elisha is constantly saving people. He brings people back to life. He brings the son, if those who recall the story, it brings a dead child back to life, and a whole host of different miracles. He heals water like Moshe does, and all sorts of miracles. And it's very interesting because while one is a disciple of the other, in fact, they're polar opposites. In other words, one stands in for the other by reclaiming his legacy, if you will, and taking it in a new direction. The word Eliyahu itself means that Eliyahu, God, right? He is my Lord. God is my God, my Lord. Eliyahu is the zealot for the name of the Lord. In steps Elisha, Eli Yeshua. God provides salvation. Salvation for whom? Not just for me, but for all of humanity. Right? So Eliyahu is the purely spiritual prophet, and Elisha fills in his legacy by adding that material human dimension as well. By bringing the name of God to humanity in that way, he ultimately is able to relate to the people in a more accessible fashion, ultimately to draw them closer to God in a manner that is very much the antithesis of the style of his master. And in fact, with that in mind, we can actually look at this chapter because it's absolutely fascinating. So let's take a look at the next verse. And let's just jump in. Came to pass when the Lord would take up Elijah by a whirlwind into heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And the first thing that we notice is that in this story, the centerpiece, as presented by the psukim themselves, the thrust of the story is not about Eliyahu going to heaven. See, that's just a fact. That's secondary. That's context for the actual events of this story. See, if you would have asked me how important, how central to the narrative is Eliyahu's ascent to heaven, I would have said, oh, wow, like Yechezkel. Fiery chariots, give me a rich description and everything. It's Ma'aseh Merkavah. Eliyahu's the end of the lifetime of Eliyahu Hanavi. That's not at all what happens. What actually happens is that it's an aside. The real story here is the rise of his disciple, of Elisha. So he is accompanied by Elisha. So what happens? Eliyahu, time and time again, tries to get him, says, "No, this is not for you. This is not your. This is my ending, and you're just a little prophet. You know, I don't want you to get burns along the way. I don't want you to see something that might be a little bit too much for you." Vayomer Eliyahu Elisha, bet Shevnafo, stay back here. You don't have to come with me. Kashem Shalachani ad Beit El. He's lying. God didn't send the Beit El. He sent him past the Jordan River. It's much further, right? Vayom, he doesn't want him to have any trouble. Right? Elisha says, no way, I'm not abandoning my master. All right, so they go to Beit El. So he's going to call his bluff. Take a look at the next pasuk. Right? I'll summarize these very briefly. All the Nevi'im come and they say to Elisha, did you know that your master Eliyahu is ascending to heaven today? As if to say, what? Right? We have this information for you. You want to hear this, write these great secrets. And Elisha says to them, obviously, I'm no dummy. I'm not a novice prophet. I'm ready for the big leagues here, right? So this story, which we tend to think of as a narrative of Eliyahu's fiery ascent to heaven, is actually not a narrative about that at all. It's a narrative about Eliyahu's rise to leadership and the new style of leadership. And the first thing that needs to be addressed is that despite the hesitations of Eliyahu, and despite the hesitations of the Bnei HaNevi'im, all the other prophets, Elisha says, what are you talking about? Don't insult my intelligence. I am up to the task. And then Eliyahu tries to get him to stay again. I'll leave you in Yericho, now near the Dead Sea. He's approaching the Jordan River on the from the south. And he says, no, Elisha says, no, I can manage it. I'm going to be okay. All right, so he goes with him and he walks together with him. So take a look now at Pasuk Zayin. So 50 men of the sons of prophets, they went. They're all standing far away from the Jordan River. The two prophets, master and disciple, Eliyahu and Elisha, they come to the Jordan River. Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, struck the waters. They were divided into one side, to the one side and to the other, so that the two went over on dry ground. Right. So what does this remind you of? Right. What is this reminiscent of? It's reminiscent, of course, of the acts of Moshe Rabbeinu, but not just Moshe Rabbeinu at the not the Red Sea, of course. Seas are not generally red. Certainly, that one was not red, but rather the Reed Sea. Okay, that's just the King James error, and the rest is history. But right, so that not just the splitting of the Reed Sea, the Yam Suf, but also that of Yehoshua, who actually split the Jordan River itself when the Jewish people were entering the land of Canaan. So, in other words, invoking not just the legacy of the revelations of Moshe, but the legacy of the organic passing of leadership from master to disciple. Except in this way, he's going to have the powers of his master, but his mode of leadership will actually have to go in a different direction. And I might add that that of Moshe and Yehoshua, while Yehoshua adhered extremely closely, and I mean extremely closely, to the legacy and teachings of his master, and even again, the events of his master, much as Elisha reenacted many of the miracles of Eliyahu, but to bring life to humanity rather than to bring miracles that testified to the power of God. In much the same way, Yehoshua was now not just a prophet, but he was a warrior. It's a different kind of model. He was a warrior who connected with that generation much more effectively, was able to inspire them not to rebel, instead to take steps in the right direction. So in much the same way, you have someone who has all the powers of his master, steps in for his master, but instead of needing to be a mirror, an echo precisely of his master, instead takes on a very different mode of leadership, which is the right one for the people at the right time. And that precisely, that paradox of passing on the baton but to a different kind of leader, is precisely what sets him up for so much success. And so I think that's the significance of the parallels to Moshe and Yehoshua. So they pass over, and he sees that Eliyahu has a request. What is your request? Pasuk Tet, verse 9, Vayichol Avram, Eliyahu Mar El Elisha. Sha'al ma'aselech b'terem elakach mi'imach. Wow. Came to us when they had gone over. Elisha says to Elisha, what shall I do for you before I am taken from you? Elisha says, let a double portion of your spirits be upon you. In other words, what is Elisha's asking? Upon me, rather. What's he asking for? Not just your powers, but double your powers. Wow, an unbelievable request. And in fact, Eliyahu responds, if you see me ascending, then indeed it will be granted to you. Okay, so let's see if he sees it. Indeed, he does, which means he is not only stepping in for Eliyahu, but he's perhaps transcending his powers doubly so. Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayichem ha'holchim haloch v'daber v'nirach ish v'susei ish v'yafridu bein shneihem. Vayal Eliyahu b'asera hashamayim. Take a look at the story. Once again, yes, Eliyahu goes up. Yes, it's miraculous. Yes, it's stunning. Yes, it's in a se'ara. Once again, we see the same word. But what's the major theme? Okay, they're going. Vayafridu bein shnehem. That's really the essence. It parted them apart. This story is not so much about Eliyahu ascending to the heavens that happens, but really it is about the separation of master from disciple, of Eliyahu from his Talmud, Elisha. And we see that in the very next pasuk. The Elisha ro'eh, you'd bet. Elisha sees the Mitzaik, and he yells out, Avi, Avi, literally, my father, my father. We see this in a few contexts in Sefer Malachim in particular, that the word Abba, that the word my father, is actually used to refer to a master, interestingly enough. My father, Rechav Yisraelu Farashav, or the great chariot of Israel and his horsemen, and their horsemen as well. V'lo ra'ahu, and he's gone. Because what? It's not just that he is mourning, but now he himself, as it were, symbolically has been split into. And now he performs the miracles of his master. He has been endowed, apparently he saw, so he's going to receive not just the same level of spiritual strength, but double the amount. He takes the mantle from his master, a great symbol. He goes to stand by the bank of the Jordan River. He hits the water. We jumped to the last page on the source sheet, and the people see him, and they still don't get it. It's actually quite a humorous end to the story. The prophets actually, if you take a look, you can see it in the Hebrew and the English. I don't read it inside, but it's a stunning little snippet to give us a sense of the gap between the insight, prophetic insight of Elisha and the other prophets who are prophets still in training. What do they say to Elisha? They say, Beth, you were saying earlier, it's a whirlwind, it's a tornado. Maybe it took our master and it tossed him a walk of days away. Who knows where he could be? He could be anywhere right now. All they know is what they saw. They saw a natural phenomenon. So what do they suggest? Let's get together a search party. Let's look for him. We're going to find our master. We're going to recover him. And Elisha says, I really don't recommend it. I really don't think it's going to be worth your time. Say, no. He says, okay, look, I'm not going to stop you. They send 50 people. They search for 3 days. Of course, they can't. They look. It says maybe the wind of God took him. He says, don't send, and they send, and they insist on it, and then they ultimately come back. They return to him in the last pasuk. V'hu yoshev b'Yericho. And he's saying in Yericho, he says, I told you not to go. Don't waste your time. So not only does the story conclude with an insight into into Eliyahu's essentially being replaced by Elisha, not only do we see that Elisha has a new mode of leadership that is not consistent with that of his master, but more than that, what we see as well is that ultimately he far transcends the prophetic powers of the other students. And I think that ultimately what emerges is exactly what we had said, which is that here the significance of the whirlwind, I think, does represent zealotry, power, a little bit of mystery as well. But the purpose of the revelation, the significance of the revelation, is not actually about Eliyahu. It's ultimately a subversive story. What's really happening is that God is implicitly critiquing Eliyahu, telling him, you haven't yet fulfilled your mission here on earth. If you think the only model of Torah leadership is embodied by the se'ara, you're a failure. Your mission is not complete until Elisha remains on earth, carries it forward on your behalf, but in a very different mode. And indeed, the very next story, I didn't include it here, just for space purposes, but if you take a look at the continuation of this very story, the very first incident is that the sons of the prophets come to him, they're sitting at Yericho, they don't have any safe water to drink. He takes a stick, he throws it in, the whole 9 yards. He makes it drinkable for them, much like the story of Marat, strikingly similar to when Moshe turns the water sweet, immediately following none other, of course, than the miracle of the splitting of the Red Sea. It's literally part of the same Kriyat Torah. We even read that is the very end of the Kriyat Torah, read back on the seventh day of Pesach a number of weeks back. And so that is the very conclusion of this inaugural chapter of the leadership of Elisha. So in sum, what we see is that the first instance of Se'ara is perhaps consistent with what we might have expected. A revelation from the whirlwind represents the power, represents zealotry, represents the overwhelming mystery of the presence of God. But ultimately, it suggests that that is not the only mode of divine revelation in this world. That when humans seek to transmit and to embody the word of God for a new generation, then ultimately sometimes what's necessary is to find a more humane, more accessible mode of leadership that is the very antithesis of this Sarah, no longer the model of Eliyahu, God is my Lord, rather that of Elisha, the man of God who's one with the people, who represents God amidst the people. And to cite one of the individuals for whom he performs the miracle of reviving her son, "B'tochami ani yoshavet," she says, "Anochi yoshavet," I sit among my people. That's true not only for that woman, it's true, of course, of Elisha as well. So this concludes our first revelation from the whirlwind. Next week, we'll, God willing, tackle one of the most difficult and obscure passages in the entire Tanakh. I don't promise to explain all of the Maaseh Merkavah. I don't promise to explain the entirety of the revelation to Ezekiel in just one simple shiur, but I do hope that we'll gain insight into the significance there and how that is similar to and perhaps part ways in very interesting and unexpected manner from the story of Elisha, and in particular to ask ourselves, in context of that story, what exactly is the significance of a revelation from the whirlwind? It has been a pleasure. Evie, I don't know if we want to wait for any last questions. I know
Yeah,
what
we have a few
protocol is.
minutes. If you would like to take questions, and if anyone has questions, we can allow a few minutes. It's up to you.
Okay. Okay, sure. That sounds great. Yeah, jump
So
in a few
feel
short
free
minutes.
to unmute if you would like to ask any questions or make comments. Looks like Beth, go ahead. Just unmute Beth.
One thing I find fascinating is that with all the Sarah whirling around, Elisha asks for a double portion
Mm-hmm.
of Elijah's Ruach.
Yeah.
And I just think that's kind of a nice twist of fate, as it were.
Yeah, and so it's worth thinking a little bit more about what that represents, and also like I always thought that that was remarkably bold, forward. Um, a little uncomfortable. Your master is dying, right? And your last words to him are, right? Can I double you? And I don't think Eliyahu was jealous of him, though. In other words, I think Eliyahu genuinely, his entire life centered around bringing the glory of God to this world. And if that's what God wanted from his successor, I think it would genuinely make him happy. That he was unsuccessful, that he might have taken the wrong path toward encouraging the people to embrace the true God doesn't mean that he wouldn't have wanted someone else to be successful, and doubly so with a different and more successful mode of communication. So in a way, I think it's the ultimate tribute to not only the flaws and limitations of Eliyahu, but ultimately to his authenticity as well.
Thank you, Rabbi Sinesky, for this very interesting class. I'm looking forward to the following weeks. And also thank you everyone who joined us today and is always being part of our learning community here at Drisha. Just a reminder that Safir Azman is ongoing. We have several other classes that are starting. So hope to see you there as well. And again, I'll see you next week. Thank you so much again, everyone. And lehitraot.